I want to walk you through Meldrum's actual evidence, the strong parts and the weak parts for the existence of Bigfoot, because I think that is how he would have wanted it. And to do that, we need to return to 1996.
Spring of 1996, a man drove unannounced to a small house in Walla Walla, Washington, expecting to expose a hoax. He was a working anatomist with a PhD from Stony Brook, a postdoc at Duke, and a tenure track position at Idaho State University. He studied primate foot bones for a living. He had come to meet a man named Paul Freeman, who had a reputation in Bigfoot circles for finding suspicious footprints. And the visiting professor's plan, in his own later words, was to use the visit to study the anatomy of a hoax. Freeman told him fresh tracks had turned up that morning, but they weren't good ones, not worth casting. The professor insisted on seeing them anyway. He drove up into the Blue Mountains and walked a muddy ridge until he found them. About 40 footprints in a row, each one 15 inches long, pressed deep into wet soil that had been undisturbed for hours. He went out there to debunk a hoaxer. He came back asking different questions for the next 30 years of his life. And last September, those 30 years ended. Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum, the most credentialed living scientist who ever publicly took the Bigfoot evidence seriously, died of brain cancer on September 9th, 2025. He was 67 years old. What I want to do in this video is talk about what he actually found on those ridges, in those casts, and in that famous film, because the version most people know is wrong in both directions. The believers oversell it, the skeptics undersell it, and the man himself, who was more careful than either side, isn't here to set the record straight anymore. So we're going to do that for him as honestly as we can. Before we go anywhere near a footprint cast, you have to understand what Meldrum's credentials actually were, because most people who talk about him online get this part wrong in one of two ways. Either they hand him sainthood, the only real scientist studying Bigfoot, or they wave him off as a crank in a lab coat. Neither version is right, and neither version does justice to the man. The plain biography goes like this. He was born in Salt Lake City in 1958. He did his undergraduate and master's work at Brigham Young University with a 2-year break in Germany on an LDS mission. He earned his PhD in anatomical sciences from Stony Brook University in 1989, with John Flegel as his doctoral advisor. And Flegel is one of the most respected primatologists alive, while Stony Brook's anthropology program is genuinely first tier. From there, Jeffrey Meldrum did a postdoctoral year at Duke University Medical Center, taught briefly at Northwestern, and joined the faculty of Idaho State University in 1993, where he stayed until he died. 32 years in the same department, teaching the same human anatomy courses to the same kind of graduate health profession students year after year. That's a real academic career, not a costume. His specialty was not Bigfoot. His specialty was the comparative anatomy of primate feet and the evolution of bipedal locomotion, basically how the foot evolved as our ancestors stopped knuckle walking and started striding. He published dozens of peer-reviewed papers in journals like the American Journal of Primatology and the Journal of Human Evolution. He co-edited a serious academic volume called From Biped to Strider about the emergence of modern human walking. None of that work was controversial, none of it had anything to do with Sasquatch. That's the resume. That's the lens he brought to the footprint casts. When Jeffrey Meldrum looked at a track in the mud, he was looking at it the way a fluent reader looks at a sentence. He could see whether the muscles, the arch, the toe placement, and the pressure distribution were anatomically coherent, or whether they were a person's idea of what an ape print should look like. That is genuinely a different lens than a hobbyist with a tape measure, and it matters more than people on either side of this debate want to admit. Now, the skeptics have a point worth raising here. Jeffrey Meldrum was a practicing member of the LDS Church, and some critics have argued that his religious background made him more open to non-mainstream claims. I personally think that's a weak argument. Plenty of religious scientists do rigorous mainstream work, and plenty of secular ones chase nonsense, but it's out there, and you should know it's out there. Jeffrey Meldrum himself said his interest in Sasquatch came from boyhood curiosity and was sustained by what he believed was credible physical evidence, not faith. He also had a defender most cranks never get. Dr. Jane Goodall, the world's most famous living primatologist, who spent 45 years studying chimpanzees in the wild, publicly said she was open to the possibility that something like Bigfoot existed, and she respected Meldrum's work. You don't get a Jane Goodall endorsement by being a crank. You get it by doing the work. His students at ISU, over 32 years of teaching, mostly described him in the same terms: calm, patient, genuinely curious, willing to take a stupid question seriously and turn it into a good one. The comment section under his obituary in the Idaho State Journal filled up with former students saying things like, "I took Dr. Meldrum's class on human evolution at ISU." Professor Jeffrey Meldrum was an excellent instructor, knowledgeable, well-prepared, and committed to student success. That's not a Bigfoot believer leaving that comment. That's an anatomy student saying their professor cared about teaching them anatomy. Those two things, the careful classroom teacher and the public Sasquatch researcher, were the same person doing the same thing in two different contexts. Quick callback for folks who've been on the channel a while. When Jeffrey Meldrum entered the Bigfoot conversation in the late 1990s, the previous academic standard bearer was Dr. Grover Krantz at Washington State University, who I've mentioned in passing before. Krantz died in 2002 and famously donated his skeleton to the Smithsonian, posed alongside the skeletons of his own dogs. We'll do a whole separate video on Krantz down the line because his story deserves its own runtime. For now, just know that Jeffrey Meldrum essentially inherited the chair Krantz had vacated, the lone serious academic willing to look at this evidence in public. All right, this is the heart of it, so I'm going to slow down. The single most important contribution Jeffrey Meldrum made to the Bigfoot evidence conversation was his work on something called the mid-tarsal break. And to understand why it matters, you need to understand how your foot is different from an ape's foot. Your foot has an arch. It's a rigid lever. When you walk, your heel strikes the ground first, your weight rolls forward through the arch, and you push off with your toes. The arch keeps the middle of your foot stiff so all that force gets transferred efficiently. It's an engineering marvel evolved specifically for the kind of long-distance striding humans do. We're the only primates built this way. An ape's foot is completely different. A chimp or a gorilla doesn't have an arch. It has a flexible midfoot, a flex point at the transverse tarsal joint in the middle of the foot that lets the front half bend independently of the back half. This is great for climbing trees and walking on uneven ground, but it's terrible for striding. When an ape walks bipedally, the middle of its foot actually bends as it pushes off, instead of staying rigid. Here's why that matters for footprints. When an ape steps in soft ground, that midfoot flex leaves a very specific mark, a raised pressure ridge across the middle of the print, where the foot pushed up the substrate as it propelled forward. A human print doesn't have that ridge. A human print has a clean arch impression, a heel cup, and a toe push-off. The two patterns are visibly different to anyone who knows what to look for, and Jeffrey Meldrum knew what to look for better than almost anyone alive. What he found repeatedly across dozens of casts from different locations and different decades was that pressure ridge. He found it in casts from the Blue Mountains tracks he saw in 1996. He found it in casts from the 1967 Patterson-Gimlin trackway at Bluff Creek. The prints Bob Titmus cast 2 weeks after Roger Patterson made his original cast. He found it in tracks from across the Pacific Northwest, and eventually from sites in China and Russia where he traveled to do comparative work. His lab at ISU eventually housed more than 300 footprint casts, and a recurring subset of them showed the same anatomical signature. There was also a second feature worth knowing about: dermal ridges. These are the tiny skin patterns on the sole of the foot, the same kind of patterns that make a fingerprint. Some of Meldrum's casts, including some of the ones Grover Krantz had studied a decade earlier from a set of tracks called the cripple foot prints, showed dermal ridge detail that experienced print examiners said couldn't be faked with the technology available at the time. Whether you find that compelling or not depends on which expert you trust, and there are good ones on both sides. The cripple footprints are worth a brief detour because they're one of the cleaner historical examples. In 1969, near Bossburg, Washington, a series of tracks were found that appeared to come from a Sasquatch with a deformed right foot, the kind of injury that would leave a permanent limp and an asymmetric print pattern. Krantz analyzed those casts at length and argued that the foot showed anatomical detail consistent with a real, healed pathological deformity that a hoaxer in 1969 would have had no incentive and no expertise to invent. Why fake a limp? Faking a limp doesn't make your Bigfoot more impressive, it just makes the hoax harder. Jeffrey Meldrum carried that argument forward into his own work, treating the cripple foot casts as one of the more compelling historical pieces of the footprint corpus.
I personally think this is the cleanest piece of evidence in the entire Bigfoot conversation, not because it proves anything on its own, but because of who would have to be to hoax.
Meldrum's argument was specifically about what a hoaxer would have had to understand. In 1967, when Patterson made his casts at Bluff Creek, the mid-tarsal break wasn't part of popular culture. It wasn't in Bigfoot movies, it wasn't in tabloid drawings, it wasn't something a guy with carved wooden stompers in his garage would have thought to fake. The same was true in 1996 when Jeffrey Meldrum himself saw the Blue Mountains tracks. To hoax that feature convincingly, you'd need a working knowledge of comparative primate foot anatomy. And then you'd need to keep doing it consistently across decades, across hundreds of miles, without ever getting caught and without ever cashing in. Now, and this is where the honest analysis lane has to do its job, the skeptics have real responses to this argument, and we're going to give them real airtime. The first comes from Robin Crompton at the University of Liverpool, whose lab published research showing that some healthy modern humans actually do flex at the midfoot, enough to produce something resembling a mid-tarsal break in a footprint. So the feature is not strictly impossible for a human print to produce. That's an honest hit on Meldrum's argument, and it deserves to be named. The second comes from people like Darren Naish, a respected vertebrate paleontologist who blogs at Tetrapod Zoology, and David Degling at the University of Florida, who's written extensively in Skeptical Inquirer. Their argument is that the features Jeffrey Meldrum cites, the pressure ridge, the toe slip marks, the dermal ridges, can in principle be explained by hoaxing methods we just haven't fully reconstructed. They argue that you can't rule out hoaxing just because you personally can't figure out how the hoax was done. That's also a fair point, and Jeffrey Meldrum took it seriously. His response, which he gave in print and in talks, was that he wasn't claiming any single track proved anything. He was claiming that the combination of features, the pressure ridge plus the absence of an arch, plus the dimensions, plus the dermal ridges, plus the consistent appearance across geography and time, was harder to explain as decades of coordinated, undetected hoaxing than as the tracks of a real, unrecognized, large bipedal animal. That's a more modest claim than the meme version of his work, and it's also a more defensible one. I personally think both sides of this have a point. The mid-tarsal break evidence is the strongest thing Bigfoot research has, and it's still not, on its own, a smoking gun. Jeffrey Meldrum knew that. He never claimed otherwise. The man who actually understood the anatomy was the man who refused to overclaim about it, which is exactly backwards from how most of the internet handles this question. Okay, the second piece of signature evidence is messier, and Jeffrey Meldrum was the first one to tell you so. On September 22, 2000, a Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization expedition was out at Skookum Meadows in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in southern Washington, filming an episode of a television show called Animal X. They baited a muddy wallow with fruit overnight. They didn't leave cameras running on it, which, as a parenthetical, would have made everyone's lives a lot easier and saved us all about 2 decades of arguing. When they came back the next morning, the fruit was gone and there was a massive body imprint pressed into the mud. The imprint was huge, 3.5 feet by 5 feet. They poured something like 200 pounds of plaster into it, and the finished cast ended up weighing about 400 pounds. Jeffrey Meldrum was brought in to look at it, along with Grover Krantz and wildlife biologist John Bindernagel. What Jeffrey Meldrum saw when he studied the cast was what he interpreted as a partial body impression, a forearm, a hip, a thigh, a heel, an ankle, and what looked to him like the impression of an Achilles tendon. His read was that a Sasquatch had laid down on its side in the mud, reached forward to grab the fruit, and gotten up without ever standing in the wet ground or leaving footprints. This cast became one of the most famous pieces of physical evidence in modern Bigfoot research, and it is genuinely contested, including by people I respect. The leading counter-hypothesis is that the impression was made by an elk. Elk are big animals. A mature bull can run 700 pounds or more, sometimes much more, and they're all over that part of Washington. A skeptical analysis by Dr. Anton Wroblewski argued that the marks could be reconciled with an elk lying down on its side and stretching to reach the fruit. And here's the part that makes the skeptic case stronger than the believer side likes to admit. Hair samples recovered from the cast itself were identified as elk and bear. Tracks of elk, deer, bear, and coyote were found in the surrounding area. There was no Sasquatch hair recovered from the cast. None. The believer's counter is that an elk wouldn't leave that specific configuration of impressions, and that an animal smart enough to grab the fruit without standing up is exactly the kind of behavior witnesses report for Sasquatch. The skeptic's response is that this is a circular argument. You can't use "it acted like Bigfoot" as evidence that it was Bigfoot. And around it goes, 25 years later, and we're still not closer to a clean answer. But here's the thing about Jeffrey Meldrum that I keep coming back to. He gave an interview to Scientific American about the Skookum cast, and they pulled out a quote from him that I think tells you more about who he was than any other quote in his career. He said about the cast, "There's a chance we are wrong." And then he said about the footprints, "But with the footprints, I feel more certain." Read that quote again. He was talking to a flagship mainstream science magazine defending one of the highest profile pieces of evidence in his entire field, and he voluntarily acknowledged the possibility he was wrong about it. That is not how a true believer talks. That is how a working scientist talks. I personally think the Skookum cast is the weakest of his 3 signature pieces of evidence. And I personally think Jeffrey Meldrum knew it. He never sold the cast as the smoking gun. He sold it as suggestive, worth studying, and possibly an elk. That distinction between suggestive and proven is exactly what most Bigfoot media gets wrong, and what Jeffrey Meldrum got right his entire career. We're going to come back to the Patterson-Gimlin film itself in a dedicated sequel video like I promised in the last PG video on the channel. But for the rest of this one, we're going to talk about the third piece of signature work, the AI restoration of the Patterson film that Jeffrey Meldrum helped lead just 3 years before he died. Here's the setup. The original 1967 Patterson-Gimlin film, the famous Bluff Creek footage of the figure now called Patty, is lost. The original camera original reel disappeared decades ago. What survives is a family tree of copies. First-generation duplicates, second-generation duplicates of those, third-generation duplicates, and on down the line. Every generation accumulates more grain, more noise, more visual degradation. By the time you're watching it on YouTube, you're probably watching a fifth or sixth generation copy of a copy of a copy. You're losing detail at every step. In 2022, Jeffrey Meldrum co-authored a paper in Relict Hominoid Inquiry, the peer-reviewed journal he edited, with a doctoral candidate named Isaac Tien from the University of Washington's Paul G. Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering, and a Hollywood special effects veteran named Bill Munns, who had been analyzing the PGF for over a decade. What they did was genuinely impressive technically. It is the most significant piece of new work done on the Patterson film in roughly 50 years. They sourced 8 independent prints of the same 150-frame segment of the film, surrounding the famous look-back frame at frame 354. That's the frame where the figure turns its head and looks directly at the camera. They photographed each print at close range with a 12-megapixel DSLR. Then they ran the 8 separate frame sets through computer vision algorithms, aligned them mathematically, and merged them frame by frame to produce a single stabilized version with the noise from any one copy effectively canceled out by the others. The result was the cleanest version of those 150 frames anyone has ever seen. This work also showed up on television. The History Channel ran a double-length special called The Proof Is Out There, Bigfoot revealed in 2021 with Meldrum, Tien, and Munns walking through the restoration on camera. If you've ever seen a clip on YouTube where Patty looks weirdly clear, unusually crisp around the head, the shoulders, the back of the neck, that's almost certainly the Tien Munns Jeffrey Meldrum work, even if the channel posting it doesn't credit them, which most of them don't.
This is the project I keep coming back to in my head when I think about Meldrum's last years. He spent the end of his career trying to make the most famous Bigfoot evidence ever filmed legible to modern science.
What did Jeffrey Meldrum specifically focus on when he looked at the restored frames? 2 things. The first was the musculature on the back of the figure's neck and the way it attached to the skull. He'd written about this for years. He argued the trapezius muscles on Patty looked anatomically ape-like, with a thick, intermediate attachment on the back of the skull that humans don't have. The cleaner the image got, the more confident he was that what was on screen wasn't a person in a fur suit. The second was the gait, the way the figure walked. Jeffrey Meldrum and Munns argued that the movement pattern, what biomechanists call a compliant gait, with bent knees throughout the stride, was inconsistent with how a person in a costume would naturally walk. A human in a suit defaults to locked knees and a normal human stride. Patty doesn't. Patty walks the way a heavy, long-limbed primate would walk if you scaled up the biomechanics. Worth knowing, this isn't the first time mainstream science has looked at the gait question. Back in 1973, Dr. John Napier, then the head of the primate biology program at the Smithsonian, reviewed the Patterson-Gimlin film and concluded that he couldn't determine whether it was real or fake, but that if it was a fake, it was an exceptionally good one. Napier is not a fringe figure. He literally wrote the standard textbook on hand and foot anatomy. The fact that he didn't dismiss the film outright in 1973 is one of the reasons people like Jeffrey Meldrum took the question seriously a generation later. Bill Munns is also worth a moment of context because his contribution to the analysis is sometimes underplayed. Munns spent over 30 years as a working creature designer in Hollywood. He built the actual suits. He knows what fur looks like when it's glued to foam latex, how the seams sit when an actor moves their arms, how a face mask distorts when the wearer turns their head. His central argument about the PGF, sharpened over more than a decade of frame-by-frame analysis, is essentially this: there are no costume artifacts. The musculature deforms as the figure walks. The hair lies flat against the body in ways that wouldn't happen with a 1967-era suit. The proportions of the limbs are wrong for a person on stilts and right for a real large primate. Munns is, of all the people working on the PGF, the one who most has the knowledge to spot a fake, because his actual job for 3 decades was to build the kind of fake he'd be looking at. He doesn't see one. And again, honest analysis. The History Channel special is entertainment, not peer review. The peer-reviewed paper itself is real and is genuinely a technical achievement, but it was published in Relict Hominoid Inquiry, the journal Jeffrey Meldrum himself edited, which is a structural conflict of interest worth naming out loud. None of this means the work is wrong. It does mean the work isn't published in, say, the Journal of Human Evolution. Skeptics will tell you that's because mainstream journals wouldn't take it. Believers will tell you that's because mainstream journals are gatekeepers. Both are partly true. I personally think the restoration itself, the technical achievement of stabilizing and clarifying those 150 frames, is one of the most important pieces of work done on the PGF in 50 years. Whether what it shows you is a real animal or a really good 1967 costume nobody has been able to reproduce since is a separate question, and we'll dig into that in the sequel video coming up. For now, what I want you to sit with is this. Meldrum, with cancer that he didn't yet know was growing in him, spent his last working years trying to give the rest of us a clearer look. That's not nothing. We've covered the evidence work. Now we have to talk about what it cost him, because this is the part of the story that almost everybody leaves out, and it's the part I think matters most. In 2006, when Jeffrey Meldrum published Sasquatch, Legend Meets Science with a New York imprint, the Idaho State University faculty turned on him publicly. The Associated Press ran a story in November of that year with a headline along the lines of, "Bigfoot research makes professor a campus outcast." Colleagues went on record. A physics professor at ISU named D.P. Wells sneered that Jeffrey Meldrum should research Santa Claus next. A biology colleague named Hackworth was quoted saying, "Do I cringe when I see the Discovery Channel and I see Idaho State University, Jeff Meldrum? Yes, I do." Roughly 30 professors signed a letter scolding the university for hosting Meldrum's Bigfoot symposium on campus. There were public calls to revoke his tenure. ISU's Dean of Arts and Sciences at the time, John Kaczynski, defended him, saying he was a bona fide scientist and that he helped the university. But the institutional pressure was real and constant. Jeffrey Meldrum spent years, actual years, eating lunch alone in his lab while colleagues had coffee 3 doors down without him. The Spokesman Review described him going about his daily work, as usual, alone in his laboratory. That phrase, as usual, carries a lot of weight. There's a small detail in the early reporting that I think captures the day-to-day reality of the situation better than any of the big controversies. A reporter described Jeffrey Meldrum opening a thin metal filing drawer in his lab and pulling out the very first Bigfoot casts he ever collected. He kept them right there, next to the jars of yellow preservation fluid and the plaster molds for his actual anatomy classes. Not in a separate building, not behind a locked door, just there in the same lab, sorted into drawers, treated like any other piece of comparative material. To Meldrum, the Bigfoot casts were a scientific specimen collection. To half his colleagues, those drawers were the reason they didn't want to be associated with him. The casts didn't move, the colleagues did. Here's the quote that gets me every time I read it. In 2017, 11 years after the worst of the tenure fight, Jeffrey Meldrum was giving a talk at Utah State University. A student in the audience apparently asked him about pursuing similar research interests, and Jeffrey Meldrum said, "For their own good, I caution them not to be open about their interests because I was naive enough to jump into that deep end of the pool before I had tenure, and it nearly cost me my career." His promotion to full professor was delayed by years, specifically because of the Bigfoot work. He told the audience in Logan that he had been granted tenure by a hair's breadth. Read that sentence again. The man we are talking about as the most credentialed Bigfoot researcher in modern history almost didn't get to be that man because his colleagues nearly fired him over the topic. He got through tenure by a single thread. His Bigfoot research was funded primarily by private donations. At one point, a $30,000 gift from a private donor because no university grant body would touch the topic. The man with the Stony Brook PhD in anatomical sciences had to pass the hat to study what he insisted was a legitimate biological question. Meanwhile, his mainstream anatomy work, the comparative foot morphology studies, the bipedalism papers, those got published in respectable journals and contributed to the field. He was doing 2 careers in parallel, and only one of them was allowed to exist openly. I personally think this is the part of the story that gets lost when people talk about Meldrum. The man paid a real, sustained professional price for 30 years to take this question seriously. And he did it without ever overclaiming. He didn't write a clickbait book about how Bigfoot was definitely real. He wrote a careful book about what the evidence looked like if you took it seriously, and he absorbed the institutional cost of doing so for the rest of his career. That's rarer than the evidence itself is, and frankly, I think it's rarer than a Bigfoot would be. If you've watched videos on this channel and ever caught yourself wondering, why don't more credentialed scientists look at this stuff? Jeffrey Meldrum is the answer. They don't because of what happened to him. And before we move into the last 2 sections, if this kind of careful, honest look at a contested topic is what you want more of, hit subscribe and turn on the bell. We do this for every video. The algorithm only sends them out to more people if you tell it you actually want them. There's no clickbait on this channel, no fabricated studies, no AI-generated evidence pulled from content farms. Just the real material, treated honestly. The audience this channel has built is the reason I can spend a week researching one of these instead of cranking out 3 a day. I appreciate every one of you for being here. Now let's finish strong. There's one more piece of Meldrum's legacy that gets almost no airtime, and it's the one I think will outlast all the others. He founded and edited a peer-reviewed scholarly journal called Relict Hominoid Inquiry, hosted by Idaho State University. He was the editor-in-chief from its launch until he died. What that means in practice is this. Before Meldrum's journal existed, anyone trying to publish serious research on relict hominoids, Sasquatch, Yeti, Almasty, Yeren, all the regional variants of the wild man tradition had basically nowhere to publish. Mainstream journals wouldn't touch it. Trade books had no peer review standards. The forums and websites that dominated the conversation were full of breathless claims with no editorial oversight at all. There was no venue that demanded citations, methodology sections, and honest discussion of alternative explanations. Jeffrey Meldrum built one. He created a venue with real editorial standards. The Tien Mun's Jeffrey Meldrum PGF restoration paper lives there. The Curlin and Hertel acoustic analysis of the Sierra Sounds, and if you saw our Sierra Sounds video on the channel, that's the study we leaned on most heavily, was republished and engaged with there. Footprint morphology studies, Yeti expedition write-ups, comparative anatomy papers, eDNA proposals. None of this is the Journal of Human Evolution, and Jeffrey Meldrum would have been the first to admit it. but it's not nothing either. It's an attempt to bring the rigor of mainstream science to a question that mainstream science refuses to touch. I personally think this is the structural piece of his legacy. The footprint casts can be argued over forever. The Skookum cast might be an elk. The PG film might be Patty, or it might be a brilliant 1967 costume nobody has ever reproduced. But the institution he built, the editorial standards, the peer review process, the journal itself, that outlives the arguments. Whoever picks up this work next will pick it up in part because Jeffrey Meldrum built a place for them to publish it. So, the facts as gently as I can put them. On September 9th, 2025, Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum died at his home in Pocatello, Idaho, after a brief battle with brain cancer. His wife, Lauren Stewart, announced his passing on social media. He was 67 years old. He had taught at Idaho State University continuously since 1993. 32 years in the same department, in the same building, mostly in the same lab full of plaster casts. What I want to do in this final section is share something the believer side coverage of his death didn't really pick up on. The most striking obituaries of Jeffrey Meldrum weren't written by his admirers, they were written by his skeptics. The Center for Inquiry, that's the publication of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, a serious anti-pseudoscience organization that disagreed with Jeffrey Meldrum about Bigfoot for his entire career, published an obituary written by Benjamin Radford. Radford had argued against Meldrum's conclusions for years in print. He had been, in his own words, the token skeptic at one of Meldrum's Bigfoot conferences in Pocatello. And what Radford wrote when Jeffrey Meldrum died was that he found him knowledgeable, friendly, respectful, and funny. He called Jeffrey Meldrum by far the marquee name in Bigfoot research, and noted that whatever one may think of Meldrum's conclusions about Bigfoot, he had well established his bona fides as a professional anthropologist. That obituary from the man whose job it was to disagree with him publicly is the truest measure of who Jeffrey Meldrum was. You can fight with someone for 30 years about whether their life's work is real, and at the end of it, your honest verdict can still be that they were a serious scientist worth taking seriously. That is a kind of professional grace most academic feuds never reach. The honest weight of what we lost is this: Jeffrey Meldrum was the bridge. He was the only person in a generation who could walk into a peer-reviewed anatomy conference in the morning and a Bigfoot field expedition in the evening and be taken seriously in both rooms. There is no obvious successor. There is no other tenured professor in the United States right now who has staked their name publicly on this question with anything close to Meldrum's credentials. When he died, that bridge went with him, and nobody has stepped onto either bank to start building a new one. What I think is genuinely worrying about Meldrum's death for anyone who cares about this question being answered honestly one way or the other is the realistic possibility that the next generation of credentialed scientists will look at what happened to him and quietly decide it isn't worth it. He warned them himself. He said it on the record in Logan in 2017. Don't be open about this before tenure. That warning will outlive him, and it will discourage exactly the kind of careful, mainstream-trained scientist the field most needs. The institutional cost he paid will keep getting paid by the people who choose not to pay it. That's how disciplines die or fail to be born in the first place.
I personally do not know if Jeffrey Meldrum was right about Bigfoot. I generally do not. What I know is that he asked the question the way it should have been asked.
He asked it patiently with real evidence, with honest acknowledgement of where his case was weak, at a personal cost most of us would never accept. Whatever Bigfoot turns out to be, a real undiscovered primate, a stubborn folkloric ghost, or something stranger than either. The conversation about it is poorer without him in it. The skeptics lost a worthy opponent. The believers lost their most credible advocate. And anatomy lost a working scientist who cared about feet for reasons that had almost nothing to do with cryptids, and everything to do with how humans came to walk upright on the savannah 2 million years ago. He was a complete academic. The Sasquatch work was one room in a much larger house. The next video on this channel will be our follow-up on the Patterson-Gimlin film itself, the deep dive I promised in the original PG video. And we're going to do that one with Meldrum's frame-by-frame analysis as our spine, because he spent his last working years making those frames clearer than anyone else ever has. That's how we honor the work, not by overclaiming on his behalf, not by pretending he proved more than he did, but by using what he built carefully, the way he built it. If you've made it this far, thank you. Genuinely, the comment section on the last few videos has been the best I've seen since this channel started. You all are sharper than half the documentarians making this stuff for a living. Tell me in the comments what you think Meldrum's strongest evidence was, or where you think his case was weakest. I read all of them. Sometimes I argue back. Sometimes I learned something I didn't know. That's the conversation he would have wanted, and that's the conversation this channel exists to have.
Thanks for watching. I'm Alex. Take care of yourselves and stay curious. I'll see you in the next one.